Um,
There you go.
just a little bit about my background, how I got here. I'm one of the few people you'll ever meet who has gotten to do the jobs he dreamed of doing as a kid. I grew up in New York City during the 1960s and 1970s, and I was obsessed with sports on television. We didn't travel much then, but sports television took me everywhere. I learned geography, math, storytelling, and character all through watching sports on TV. I was just mesmerized by it. One of the first sporting events that I remember watching was the 1971 Rose Bowl, which featured Stanford University, and Jim Plunkett was the quarterback, and they upset undefeated and second-ranked Ohio State that day. And from then on, I always wanted to go to Stanford. Of course, for a long time, I thought Stanford was actually in Pasadena, so it took me a long time to figure that out. As much as I loved sports television, I always dreamed for more as a kid. I wanted a product that could combine live sporting events with a print narrative, with photography, video highlights, real-time scores, and statistics. ESPN.com, the product that I am most associated with, product that I actually worked closest with Eric Johnson on, did not exist when I was growing up. It didn't exist when, like you, I was at a university. It didn't exist when I started my career. As a matter of fact, it didn't exist halfway through my career. So I think there's a lesson to that, which is that if you follow your passion, it tends to take you to a good place professionally. And you guys are living in an age where change is only accelerating. So if you haven't found that thing yet, it could be coming soon. After I graduated from Stanford, I got my first job at CBS Sports. Then I was in charge of broadcasting at the National Basketball Association during the Dream Team era. For all of you who are watching The Last Dance, a terrific documentary on ESPN, I lived that. That was my era at the NBA. It was great to be able to watch it over the last few weeks. From there, I went to Sports Illustrated and then to ESPN, as Eric said, for over 20 years, the last 15 of which I was in charge of ESPN.com, ESPN app, fantasy, streaming, podcasting. For me, it was truly a dream job. After I left ESPN in June of 17, I reunited with the NBA Commissioner Emeritus, David Stern, my former boss, and we created a portfolio of sports tech startups, which we named Micromanagement Ventures. And this is a look at some of the companies within that portfolio. They're divided between sports media startups, sports betting, and player health. As you know, David suffered a brain hemorrhage last December, and he died on New Year's Day. It was a very sad start to what continues to be a rugged year for sports, certainly a rugged year for all of us. With David gone, my work with sports startups continues, and I still love what I do. To mention another appearance at Stanford University, the very best commencement address I ever watched was the one that Steve Jobs delivered on June 12, 2005, where he basically says, you have to find that thing that you love to do. If there's anything that I leave you with today, then the most important thing in my career is to find that which I love to do. And again, I've been remarkably lucky that I actually got to do that and continue to do it today. So without further ado, we're going to talk about what's next in sports. This is a view of the pretend fans at South Korean baseball games taking place now. So Jason Gay in the Wall Street Journal kind of summed this up well. The pandemic shutdown is nothing less than the most seismic disruption in the history of sports. The economic impact of what's happening now will be vast. The way games at every level will be played and viewed is likely to change forever. Every athlete on earth will remember this time for the rest of their lives. Economic impact you've heard about, huge. ESPN did a study, concluded that there'd be at least $12 billion in revenue and hundreds of thousands of jobs lost. And that's before we get to possible cancellation of any or part of the college and pro football seasons this fall. Could be double that. On Real Sports with Brian Gumbel on HBO, they talked about the biological bomb that was the game played in Italy between Atalanta and Valencia in the Champions League that really drove the virus in Italy. In that, on that show, they also talked about how the NBA and NHL continued to play into mid-March, even after the local government had been encouraging them to stop playing, raising the troubling question of whether or not sports unwittingly and irresponsibly actually spread the coronavirus. Dr. Fauci says, I would love to be able to have all sports back. And as a health official and physician scientist, I have to say that right now, when you look at the country, we're not ready for that yet. Of course, I just want to see if you're paying attention, because that's not actually Dr. Fauci. That's Brad Pitt playing Dr. Fauci on Saturday Night Live. But the quote is as stands. Adam Silver, commissioner of the NBA, this is a quote you get from him any day now. There's still too much uncertainty at this point to say precisely how we move forward. Friends of mine at leagues describe the situation as sands shifting under one's feet all day long. And I'll leave you with two other pieces of context. One from a local hero, the late and famous screenwriter William Goldman, who in his book, William Goldman did screenplay for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and All the President's Men, among other famous movies. He starts his book with a quote, "Nobody knows anything." So as you go through and think about what we're going to talk about, just keep that in mind, as well as the wisdom, go back one slide, as well as the wisdom from my father, Ed Kosner, a newspaper and magazine editor, who subscribes to the theory of the least worst, meaning that in life, frequently you don't have any good choices, you just have two terrible choices, and you wind up choosing the least terrible of the two. Again, keep that in mind as we go through what sports is encountering at this moment. So when you have a cataclysm like the coronavirus, it tends to accelerate trends that were already in play. One of the trends in sports is just the growth of esports, which is probably a part of some of your life. Before COVID, esports was actually the third most popular spectator sport behind the NFL and NBA, especially in the really prized demographic, ages 13 to 35. Eric himself has done a considerable amount of work in this arena, so he's well familiar. According to a McKinsey study, 10% of the audience for esports watches 20 hours per week. Esports is actually sort of an orthogonal challenge to sports because people watch it on PCs and computers and stream it rather than watch it on linear television. So while it captures a lot of audience, it doesn't necessarily cannibalize what's happening on linear television. People are seeing it on other screens. With sports going away, traditional TV networks like ESPN quickly turned to esports, including examples like the NBA 2K tournament that ran in April. Key trend I see is that traditional sports are actually following esports and will continue to do so. I'm saying esports and gaming combined. Kate Javari, the new chief marketing officer at the NBA, her former stop was at Twitch. It's not a coincidence. In general, however, what's really significant, I would submit to you, is that esports and gaming are part of a revolution in media. And that's that basically there's an ever-expanding, practically infinite supply of interesting content for audiences under 30 that is available for free. And here I'm talking about networks you know well: YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Snap, and Twitter, just to mention 6. This is a viewing revolution that is distinguished by our ability now to watch pretty much whatever we want, whenever we want, and wherever we want. And for many of you, it's also distinguished by the ability to play games wherever and whenever you want. We saw the effect in chess recently where the coronavirus canceled an FIDE tournament. So Marcus Carlsen and 7 other grandmasters created their own tournament, which Marcus won with taking home the first prize of $70,000. What's interesting about this tournament is that they began to play games that lasted an hour or less, games in 15 minutes, a much more modern format, I would submit, for chess than what we get where you have 45 minutes between moves. Many of you watched the Last Dance documentary that I talked about. It was averaging 6 million viewers per episode. The first round of the NFL draft, which took place in Roger Goodell's basement, drew 15.6 million television viewers. But I call your attention to the Travis Scott concert on Fortnite, which drew practically 28 million unique in-game participants. The cumulative effect of the revolution I'm talking about, coming from these different sources, is putting traditional US linear television into decline. So here what I'm talking about is live television, television that you have to watch at a given period of time in order to get the program that you want. It's the traditional TV networks and broadcast stations. In the first quarter alone, Netflix gained 16 million subscribers. With no live sports, 2 million people cut the cord of traditional linear television just in the first quarter of this year. What that means, because linear television is the lifeblood of sports, is less money in the system to invest in sports rights, less people watching pay television, diminishing the advertising value that's around traditional linear television. A practical effect of that, and that's it, that hits all of you guys, is college sports as we know them is in some peril. The 2020 NCAA tournament was canceled. That's the preponderance of the NCAA's revenue, and it's critical to every school and university in the country. We're not clear when or if college football is going to play in the 2020-21 season. And these things have a domino effect because if the big revenue sports can't play, it may force colleges to cancel other men's and women's sports. Another big development recently was 2 of the top high school basketball players, Jalen Green and Isaiah Todd, are now going directly to the NBA's development league, the G League, where they will be paid. This represents a shot across the bow for the one and done system in men's college basketball and could well change how men's college basketball is played if the top players actually start going right to the pros. So let's talk about where we are at the moment. Key issues with sports coming back are safety and testing. In this way, athletes, the people who run the sports, are the same as you and me, and they're worried about the same thing. And with the way the coronavirus spreads, with the devastating effects it can have on people, there's just no upside to anybody to take chances. So there's concern all over the map. Henry Abbott, who is a colleague of Eric and mine at ESPN and has a terrific pro basketball newsletter called True Hoop, said, restarting will mean testing like crazy, which either means solving the nation's testing crisis, which we are nowhere close to doing, or grand scale cutting in line. This illustrates the PR problem that sports has because it requires a tremendous amount of testing in order to make sure that the players and participants are safe, but it can't risk doing that testing if it means taking out of supply testing for those who are really at risk and need the testing help. And we're not helped here by not having any federal plan for testing. Thus, testing remains a state-by-state issue. Bill Gates, who has been a giant in this period of time, including with his investment behind various vaccine initiatives, said the chance of mass spread at sporting events is quite large. And what this means is that you will not see crowds at sporting events anytime soon. I read recently that the Professional Bull Riders Association is planning to have live crowd for their event in South Dakota in July, but they are clearly the outlier. Mary Meeker of Bond Capital makes the point that 73% of Americans, practically all of us, are having their household incomes reduced because of the coronavirus. So that just means less money in the system to invest in sports, watch sports. Again, we're unlikely to be able to go to sports anytime soon. The array of challenges here facing sporting organizations is daunting. For one thing, you need federal, state, and local approvals with sports like basketball, hockey, and baseball, which play in both the US and Canada. You require country approvals. Approvals between countries are complicating the status of tennis, the most international of all sports. In the case of Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau has said that if US athletes travel into Canada, they will have to quarantine for 2 weeks before they can play. That's probably going to limit the likelihood of playing any games in Canada this summer. Then you have issues of, okay, what venues can you play at? How many locker rooms do they have? What are the hotels? Do you have transportation available? Do you have ready security? How are you going to manage television production of these events? Do you have the necessary medical staff, again, without denuding the local needs of the community for that same staff? Unlike a lot of the country and the gig economy, sports have powerful unions, and you're seeing a host of collective bargaining agreement issues emerge now. Are the players willing to play for less? How does that get resolved? Then you have the issue of do you separate athletes and their families to keep everybody safe? The fantastic baseball player Mike Trout raised the question, well, his wife's pregnant, so he's not planning to miss the birth of his child. Does that mean that he will have to quarantine for 2 weeks after the birth of his child? There are an endless number of issues like this. Also, and crucially, players haven't been playing for a while. So even when sports are ready to come back, you're going to require probably at least 3 to 4 weeks of training time for athletes. And we're really raising the likelihood that we could face a bunch of injuries if we're not careful. An unnamed league official basically gave an answer that's similar to my dad's least worst. There are a bunch of ideas, and they're all degrees of bad. So who will come back when? Well, helping this case is sports' best friend, the state of Florida, which has determined that professional sports and media production with a national audience is an essential service. So that helped usher back UFC, WWE, and others are likely to follow. The sport that I think is best positioned right now is golf. We're looking at Rory McIlroy. If you think about golf, players already operate at a distance from each other. They'd be just as happy playing with no crowds there. And they're, I believe, in fairly good position to be able to play a season that looks like what we're used to. You're already seeing foursome events happen. Rory McIlroy and Dustin Johnson played last weekend, and we have the event with Tiger Woods, Phil Mickelson, Tom Brady, and Peyton Manning coming up this weekend. International soccer debuted last weekend with the Bundesliga playing before no crowd. It was kind of wild to watch the first goal scored and you weren't sure that the goal had been scored because there was no noise. And then the player who scored the goal didn't know what to do because he wasn't allowed to hug his teammates. So he wound up running around and clenching his fist. Major League Soccer is planning to come back this summer. Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL all have different configurations of bubble cities. They'll probably play in fewer venues. Today, the news came out that Walt Disney World is the leading consideration for the NBA. The NBA has also talked about playing the Eastern Conference in Orlando and the Western Conference in Las Vegas. Tennis, as I mentioned, has a bunch of complications because the players are from all over the world, all subject to different issues in terms of where they play and how you'd handle quarantining. The NFL has been hoping for business as usual, but there was kind of a tell when their schedule came out because the way it was organized configures well if they have to delay. And the whisper date has been October 15th as the potential date that they could hold and wait to play and still get a full season in. But there are any number of complications there. Hard to imagine a Super Bowl with no fans present. The NFL has the most valuable of the TV rights, and a lot of the perspective of the return of sports, I think, is going to rest on what they're able to do, and they're dealing with a tremendous amount of uncertainty themselves. Foresight Award, well, that has to go to the All England Lawn Tennis Club because after the SARS outbreak in 2003, the people who run Wimbledon actually purchased pandemic insurance for $2 million a year. And this year, the policy paid out for $142 million, which to me is one of the great stories in sports.
Wow.
The 2020 Summer Olympics scheduled to begin in Tokyo, where those have been moved back to 2021 at a cost of another $3 billion. And that sets up the odd alignment of the Summer Olympics ending and then 6 months later in China, the Winter Olympics playing in February of 2022. College sports. What do we think athletic directors are saying? I'll give you a hint. It's help because there are all these configurations and nobody really knows. It's very complicated to think about staging sporting events with student athletes if the rest of the students aren't there. It's also complicated by what one would choose to do with all the international students that are a big part of universities like UCLA. It's May 20th today, but there's still considerable uncertainty as to what the fall is going to bring.
Hey, John.
Yes.
Can I stop for a second? Because I think that there's a lot of questions that have been coming in and on that section.
Great.
So, Corey, why don't you go ahead?
Terrence?
Yeah, hey John, thanks for coming to speak with us. I just had a question regarding your involvement at Micromanagement Ventures. Specifically, which of the startups that you work with are you most excited for in terms of their potential and where you think sports is going in the future?
I mean, I give David Stern a lot of credit because he had identified a bunch of these companies before we started working together in June of 17, but several of them are very exciting. One I love in particular is WSC, which is an Israeli-based sports video highlights company that basically creates and distributes sports video highlights using computer vision. When Eric and I were at ESPN, most of that work was done as a combination of manual work using software systems. WSC actually analyzes video. So for instance, they can, their software can analyze game from the NBA Finals, and it knows who Kevin Durant is. It knows who Kawhi Leonard is. So you set the tool and say, okay, I want to see the best plays from those two players in the fourth quarter of game one, And within a minute, it can dynamically spit out a highlight package. It can put a cover slide on it. It can cut those highlights simultaneously in landscape and portrait. So you could deliver an Instagram story and a Snapchat story at the same time that you deliver a one-box video to Google. They're based in Israel. They have clients all over the world. They're, to me, a magical company. They're totally changing the way highlights are done. If any of you guys are familiar with the House of Highlights, a big success for Turner, the underlying software is WSC. So under sort of future of media, that's a great company. We have a betting company. It's actually not considered a betting company officially. We have a little company called Jackpocket, which allows you to purchase a lottery ticket on your smartphone. And when I first heard about this, I thought, well, it's a lottery. Well, who cares? Well, the lottery, of course, is huge. And if you're able to purchase a ticket on your smartphone and use a PayPal or other payment system, a lot of the reason not to play the Powerball or Mega Millions tends to disappear because you don't have to go to the bodega, you don't have to go to the gas station, you can get your friends to play with you. All those things that we know how to do on smartphones are possible in this application. The additional magic to Jackpocket is that in several states, the lottery commission, like Ohio and DC and New Mexico, the lottery commission is actually in charge of sports betting. So it's sort of a backdoor into sports betting. Jackpocket is now the leading retailer for lottery tickets in Texas. So I'm excited about them. In terms of player health, we have a terrific company called Whoop, which you may have heard of, which is basically a wearable that tracks your sleep and recovery and is favored by elite athletes. Rory McIlroy, for instance, is an investor in Whoop, and it enables athletes, type A executives, all to better understand importance of sleep, diet, rest, and recovery. And it moved to a subscription model, and the business took off. So lots of promising companies here. Those are three that I'm particularly excited about.
That's great. We have take one more question.
Matt.
Yeah, thanks for being here, John. Going back to esports, I'd be curious on your thoughts on why, obviously seeing huge growth during the pandemic, but more specifically as it relates to like League of Legends, Overwatch, Fortnite, whereas, 2K's tried with the players match, Madden's been going on, but you haven't really seen a growth in the sporting games despite no live sports. Just curious on what you think's driving that, and if it's just a lag or what the end game is.
I asked, there's a super bright guy named Kevin Lin, who's one of the co-founders of Twitch, and I asked him that question a couple years ago. And he said you have to differentiate between simulation games like NBA 2K and FIFA and others with sort of fantasy games and first-person shooters. He said, for instance, and the NBA 2K League tends to play at the same time the NBA games are playing, which he found perplexing because he said, listen, I can watch Steph Curry play for real. Why do I want to watch someone simulating Steph Curry? Whereas the strategies in fantasy games like League of Legends or in first-person shooter games are a whole different dynamic. There's exponentially bigger audience for the non-sports games. The sports games do generate a tremendous amount of attention within sports because everybody is waiting and hoping that they might become bigger. I think they're incremental to the whole sort of apparatus here, and that you're going to wind up seeing sort of esports and regular sports double headers in sports, and just another way that sports can be relevant to other audiences. But if you look at Twitch, the numbers of people watching and playing the sports games is very, very small compared to the biggest of the esports titles.
Great.
Should we continue, Eric?
Yeah, let's continue. And I know I want to still have questions at the end and have time for that.
That's great. So when sports comes back, what will it look like? Well, we've already gotten a little taste of it with Bundesliga and others. There's no fans, at least to start. On your right is a visual from one of the baseball documents of how they might sort of try to make the playing area safe. You're going to have, because all sports have been off, you're going to have this incredible compression of all sports playing at the same time, which is going to be exciting, but also confusing for people, difficult for broadcasters and advertisers. You have the advent of bubble cities. Orlando or Las Vegas are two examples where the hope, at least, is that you could bring an entire league or a conference or a division to a particular city, set up in one hotel, operate out of one or more venues, and be able to have a degree of control over what's going on that isn't possible if you're playing in your normal stadiums. The NFL is not talking about playing in bubble cities, but I think they are making arrangements that teams could double up in stadiums if certain cities or states wound up being closed. So, for instance, there was a discussion that if California didn't permit live play, the California teams might play in Phoenix or might play in Las Vegas, sort of alternating with the Cardinals and with the Raiders. Travel in general is just a big issue, and I think it's the new normal is a bunch of us just took traveling for granted, and now traveling is a significant step. In the case of pro teams, they will travel private as always, and that's easier. But for instance, when Fox broadcast the NASCAR race this past Sunday, there was a pretty skeletal crew that was working on it. And none of the TV people were actually in Darlington, South Carolina. It was all feeds that were brought into other places and cut separately. So that's something that's going to be radically different. You're not going to go to a venue and see a big TV truck there and hundreds of people working on the broadcast. A particular focus for me is all the technology that's going to be needed to try to make fanless broadcasts interesting. For any of you who watched any of these events so far or have seen the WWE matches with no crowds or whatever, it's not super compelling to watch. So I feel like the industry has to add sight, sound, and motion to broadcasts to make them compelling and to make sure that people are going to watch longer, that it'll be a better experience for everybody, including the advertisers who they hope to bring back. One of the possible technologies at play is augmented reality. You're very familiar with it in sports with devices like the 1st and 10 line, or in the case of NASCAR, these pointers that tell you who's driving which car and where they are in the race. There's work going on now to try and see if you can configure augmented reality to cover empty seats, to provide other graphics or movement to make the broadcast more interesting. Artificial intelligence is becoming a bigger and bigger factor in sports. I talked about the great work that WSC, the video highlight company, is doing. We're looking at startups now that can actually record fan audio, fans watching a game with audio recorded on their phones and then automatically connected to the broadcasters to potentially include in broadcast. That's one of the startup efforts that's being made now. Audio is going to be increasingly important. Natural language processing, being able to make better use of voice technologies to help expedite different things that are going on, because we're not going to have a lot of people and we're not going to have any kind of high touch going on when people are in sporting venues. Personalization is going to be more and more important. That's, you've seen what personalization has done for services like Netflix and Amazon and Spotify. It's going to be coming increasingly to sports. In a world where right now we can't go to sporting events, we can't go to sports bars, we can't invite anybody over to watch a game, unless they're under our own roof, you're going to see the development of watch party technology to try to facilitate a way that a bunch of us could watch a sporting event together and enjoy it that way. And of course, underlying a lot of what's happening is going to be betting, which another trend is going to accelerate because of COVID-19. I expect you're going to see more and more states legalize sports betting. More and more states will actually go to allow true mobile wagering, not mobile wagering that exists within a physical casino, but mobile wagering that exists anywhere within the state, which is what's happening in New Jersey. I believe you're going to see that accelerate. Raises a big question, which is what happens with advertising now? So this is Ed Earhart, former colleague of Eric and mine from ESPN. And Ed is an advertising visionary, and he used to ask us when we talked about a property whether it was a left or a right. And this is sponsorship terminology to whether or not the sponsorship precedes the name of the event or follows it. So a left would be the AT&T Rose Bowl. A right would be the Rose Bowl presented by Vizio. And in the world that's coming, we're probably going to need a left and a right, because we're entering a world now where it's not clear who's going to buy a car. It's not clear who's going to travel, who's going to purchase a big ticket appliance. The idea that even if we have big audiences that we're going to welcome back a lot of advertising seems to me to be unlikely. Advertising will come back, but that's another business that's going to change. The traditional upfronts in network TV have been delayed, and it's not a sure thing that the way advertising has been done on television and on television sports is going to continue the same way. Once fans can come back, I think the new normal you're looking at is staged capacity. Teams allowing in 20% of the seats, then third, and then getting to a half and maybe more. You're going to have a real emphasis around hygiene, heat checks when you check in, when you come into the stadium or the arena, more Clorox wipes than you've ever imagined, hands-free food stations, grab and go, and one's ability to order food that could be delivered from your seat. And of course, as I mentioned before, betting. In this new world, who will be the true elite performers? Well, one guess is the referees, because in a venue, when you don't have any fans in the venue, there's less impact on the referees, and we think that they may be able to call the action better. Who will be the first MVPs in the new sports world? I think it's going to be the attorneys, because there are going to be so many disputes about money and how you divide up a shrinking pie that the only ones stand to benefit, I believe, are going to be the attorneys. But I do leave you with a little silver lining, which is a positive benefit of all of this tumult and trouble is going to be the acknowledgement that fans matter. Because when you think about what sports are like without fans in the venue, it's not nearly the same. And I felt, as someone who's been in the industry, I felt like fans have frequently been taken for granted, ripped off, not appreciated. And this is going to bring in very, very clearly why fans are so important. And I believe one roadmap to success for successful sports properties, broadcasting companies, etc., will be to really elevate fans and make them whole. That, I believe, is a big path back. As sports fans, we're all aware of dream teams, great teams that command our attention, like Michael Jordan's Bulls and the Golden State Warriors, the Yankees, the Crimson Tide, and the New England Patriots. But the truth of the matter is that right now we and all of sports really need this global dream team of healthcare professionals around the world trying to come up with vaccines and medications that can bring us back to a more normal situation and restore sports into that place in our lives that we really miss. So thank you all for having me today. I hope you all have continued success and that you stay well. And Eric, time permitting, we could do some more questions.
We absolutely can. I know that there's a lot there. I wanted to make a comment, and that was wonderful, John. So thank you very much. This Fans Matter, as you know, at ESPN, we did 2 different marketing campaigns that tried to show without sports what would the world look like, and then even on the business side, we tried to show the life and the day of a sports fan with no sports. Never did in my wildest dreams think that we were foreshadowing what was going to happen to us.
Right, exactly.
Anyway, I want to make sure that we get some of the questions. I have a couple myself still, but Corey, why don't you take us out?
Ryan?
Yep. Hi, John. This is going back a ways, but you were at the NBA when the network switch from CBS to NBC happened. And my question was mostly just around when a network switch like that happens, what at a league level is done to kind of help that adjustment, either for the broadcaster or just internally at the league itself?
It's so funny you asked the question because it's one of my favorite moments in my whole career. Pro basketball is my favorite sport, and I had gone from CBS in 1987. CBS at the time had the NBA rights. They were paying about $175 million over 4 years for those rights. And we felt, when I got to the NBA, we felt that they were significantly undervalued. The deal that we made with NBC Sports was worth $601 million over 4 years. So you went from 173 to 601, and that was just a seismic, crazy jump. I remember in preparing for the negotiation, I made this list, and the list was, in all the major markets in the NBA, the superstar player playing there and his age. And if you remember, this is a dream team era, you had Michael Jordan, you had Patrick Ewing, you had Charles Barkley, you had Isaiah Thomas. It was amazing. But at that time, we had to do a sales job about pro basketball. And CBS was aghast at the price we wanted and what others were willing to do. Once we made the deal with NBC, one of the really crucial developments was that we had this Disney-like attention to detail that started with David Stern and the other people he hired. So we had a whole plan. We had a whole plan for how we would talk to NBC about the things that they needed to do, get their ideas, facilitate what they wanted. This was months and months of preparation. And we had great ideas. They had great ideas. They had terrific announcers, Marv Albert and Bob Costas. But one of the things you learn in careers is so much is actually good fortune. The linchpin person of the whole deal was an ad sales guy named Jim Burnett, who Eric may know.
I do.
Famous network sports ad sales guy. Right before the Super Bowl, this is 1990, Super Bowl 1990. Jim Burnett tells us that he's going to go to market, and instead of having 2 automobile advertisers on the NBA and NBC, he's going to sell 8. So CBS had 2, and he was going to sell 8. He was going to give them each 1 quarter exclusivity every other game. So if you're a Mitsubishi, you'd get a spot in the first quarter 1 week, and maybe the fourth quarter the next week. That's the way it was. That's the way it was going to work. And he had a whole plan. He went out. NBC had the Super Bowl. He sold the whole plan in. He also sold this huge halftime sponsorship to McDonald's. Okay. Within a couple of weeks, we had practically $350 million of advertising already committed to the property. The following week, the economy went through the floor. There was a terrible recession that began, and all of a sudden, everything dried up. And I'll never forget that had Jim not had the plan, not had the initiative to sell it at the Super Bowl, for all the great plans, for all the fantastic things we have, it might have been a much different story. The fact that he was such a good ad sales person made the property fantastic because it was a great aesthetic success. You remember this was the rise of Michael Jordan, but also it was a big financial success. And when you can get to win-wins in business, that just lifts everything. You know, one of the reasons that, you know, I've never been an ad sales executive, but one of the reasons that Eric and I have an affinity for each other is we appreciate that all these pieces have to come together if you're really going to do really, really well. So attention to detail, brilliant people, and also some good luck.
Yeah, that's great. Corey?
Leslie Guam.
Hi. Thanks for being here, first of all. I really appreciate your presentation.
Leslie.
Hi. I was wondering what effect, if any, do you see COVID having on the individual sponsorships for players themselves?
Really interesting question. A friend of mine from Under Armour said that they were giving a lot of consideration to moving from players to influencers in terms of who they would choose to sponsor, because influencers don't tend to retire. They don't tend to have off seasons. So the pressure on everybody, I think is only increasing. What it means to be relevant in this era is different than before. What it means for players to be relevant when they're not playing is different. A lot of players have huge social followings, which is a big asset. But as you know, you can tell the difference between those who actually create their own stuff themselves and really care about it, and those who have their agents doing it. So I tend to think that the savvy players and management teams are going to continue to be fine. Others may get picked off by stars on YouTube. One of our micromanagement ventures companies that I love is Overtime, which is a video network that covers high school basketball, football, soccer, esports, and is really the place to help launch Zion Williamson. And if you look at the media savvy of high school athletes coming out of school compared to 5 years ago, compared to the dark ages when I was in high school, there's no comparison. So I do think it's going to get more competitive for existing athletes, and they're going to be expected to do more.
Thank you.
Justin.
Thank you. My question is more specifically around the NFL. I know that people have kind of been wondering if the NFL is going to decline long term due to safety issues, and I'm curious if you believe that the NFL is destined for a long term decline, and if so, does Corona speed that up, or where do you see that going?
It's a fascinating question. I suspect that the answer is no, even with the reality of CTE and the injuries, because the game is so popular, so compelling, so part of the culture. Certainly in the Midwest, certainly in the Southeast. Over time, I believe that people are going to say, okay, as a professional sport, people choose to play that. They know the risks getting in. It's very entertaining. People may begin to view it like boxing and UFC. Where I think it's going to get into some trouble will be in college football or in high school, where the idea of players taking on the same risk seems not prudent. If fewer people play, it will impact the quality of people playing at the pro level. But if you just look at the viewership data and the popularity of football and how important it is to betting, it's going to be a long time before that declines. I would also ask Eric his opinion, because Eric thinks about this a lot.
Yeah, no, I think that you said it very well. I think that the college system is going to be the most challenged, without a doubt. And if the NFL is going to have a small leak, but it's a small leak that's going to be able to last for decades and decades and decades potentially.
Yeah.
I will say it happens to be a sport that you don't have to have played to enjoy watching. Right?
Yeah. I just will say, it seems absurd to me that Trevor Lawrence wins the national championship as a freshman and can't just go and play pro football right after that. That just seems absurd to me. And the idea that he's taking hits and getting beaten up and losing some of the economic advantage he has. You only have so many years as an athlete. So that, I believe, could and should change.
Yeah. Corey?
Tim?
Thanks, Corey. Hi, John. This is a esports question. With such a large audience, what do you see as the next step in evolution or monetization of esports?
You know, it's funny. It reminds me a little bit of podcasting, where you have all this usage and popularity, but you don't necessarily have big revenue in terms of media rights behind it yet. Those of us in traditional sports keep on waiting for esports to act similarly. But the truth is, for the most powerful esports, the most powerful of the publishers, esports is sort of like a marketing expense. You know, most of the money comes from in-game transactions, and the publishers traditionally have wanted to have wide exposure to serve their fans and grow their fan base. You know, while they sell out these huge venues, the ticket prices are very, very low. So the publishers, who are essentially like the leagues, you know, and own the thing lock, stock, and barrel, are going to sort of have to decide whether they actually want to add more premium elements to what they're doing to make their media rights more valuable. I remember when freemium models started with gaming, I was trying to get my head around it. And then I began to see the logic. Well, you get people in there to begin with, and then you sort of upsell them into other things that they can do. That's now become the norm, which is totally different than sports, where, you know, only a handful of people get the rights, and they pay a tremendous amount for them. I just think that esports is going to continue to grow and develop. And if there's good marketing to make esports interesting to those who don't play the game, then I think the sky's the limit. You know, for instance, like I find League of Legends very entertaining, but I don't play the game. It's hard for me to explain to anybody else how you'd get started. There's a whole storytelling aspect that is missing for me that could be developed. You know, like UFC, I forget what the Ultimate Fighter. There's a reality show around UFC that really helped spawn its growth, and I think the same thing is necessary. Again, I would defer to Eric here, because he works on this every day.
I do. Yeah, I think it's going to take consolidation is what it's going to take. Organization. There's way too many opportunities and way too many things. I think I made the reference before. It's like if you had the NFL, the PGA, Bundesliga, U.S. tennis, and Major League Baseball all launch at the same time, where you have the leagues themselves are fighting the teams themselves who are fighting the players themselves to come up with some financial model that makes it easy to buy and to sell. And that's what's missing in esport right now. And you still have a situation where there's not as many global deals as you would think. And esport is a global sport. So how different countries come together and marketers think about the world a little bit differently. I'm surprised they have not already. But it's very regionally based, and so therefore there's a lot of waste in a lot of marketers' minds. But we're definitely trying to build that. I'm working with somebody on the college system, and right now the colleges have a lot of esports players on campus, but what they don't have is a connection actually to the college to the degree that they become an alumni base. And it's the sport behind John right now is filled with a lot of 40-year-old alums, and that's why college football is such an incredible business. It's not because of the students that are actually at the school at the time.
Right.
So we have two more questions, John, if you can run over. I want to make sure to be respectful of your time. But first, I have one that I wanted to make sure we hit. You talked about the idea and showed, you said linear television is the lifeblood of sports rights, and you showed data on the 6% down, I think it was, for first quarter. Like there's about a bomb that's going to be launched here in another month when they see what happens with second quarter. So do you see that, how do you see that affecting future sports rights, whether it's the ones that are coming up really soon with NFL, NBA, et cetera? I'd love your thoughts.
I mean, I see this as being pretty profound. I just feel like there's less money in the system. You know, our former company, Disney, has all kinds of challenges at the moment. They were, they were having a historically great year, and now you have theme parks closed, you have cruise ships docked, you have no movies, you have no sports for ESPN. So, you know, the psychology within the company has to be totally different than it was in the fall, and they're expected to be a big bidder. So there's less money in the system. I can imagine, especially for the most important properties like the NFL, that a bunch of networks will sacrifice their margin and just say, we have to stay relevant, we have to stay, we have to matter. We could go out of business or not be necessary without those rights. But that's only for properties like the NFL and NBA, you know, maybe one or two others. Sports continues to hope that digital companies like Apple and Amazon and Facebook and Google will come in and write huge checks. I'm skeptical that that's going to happen because the big digital platforms already have the customers. They're not going to gain any more customers because they have, say, NFL Sunday Ticket. They could very well have more engagement from that audience, and that's great and has real value. But sports rights for companies like ESPN and CBS and Fox, they're existential. If you don't have those rights, you don't need to exist. That's not the same as how YouTube wakes up and thinks about itself, or Apple or Amazon. Yeah. So I believe we're sort of headed to a really broad reset. And that's probably going to mean, at least short term, less money for everybody. I don't necessarily know that that's a bad thing in terms of how sports will develop or what will happen or the creativity that's necessary, but I do believe it's going to be profoundly different. I'm also of a mind that we're still early in this process, that we're not close to sort of getting, you know, we're not close to having a vaccine, we're not close to having medication. So we're stuck in the accordion here. The longer this goes on, the more uncertainty, it just figures, at least short term, to depress values.
Yeah. Corey?
Leslie, I know that kind of touched on your question. Did you have any follow-ups with that?
Yeah, so that was actually my question exactly.
Oh, no!
But you answered it, John, so thank you. My follow-up question is, the concerns with linear TV is they don't really know their audiences. And your second point earlier in the deck was, you know, fans first, fans are important. These linear TVs, like if I'm watching it or a kid's watching it, but his dad pays for it, you know, you're not actually understanding who the fans are. And there's that break. And like you also said about House of Highlights and that Israeli company, people want shorter content. They want highlights. So I'm kind of curious about, you know, data on fans from a linear TV standpoint, and then also like the actual content, you know, short form versus a full game.
So it's a really great question. You're seeing with connected TV devices and like the Roku box and others, you know, addressable advertising coming to linear television. That's becoming a bigger deal. You're beginning to have a better sense of the audience that you're actually reaching. However, fewer and fewer people, especially younger people, are starting off with linear television. I did a presentation one time, which was that input 2 has become input 1 for anybody who's familiar with using your TV set. And my point was that when you got like an Apple TV or a Roku box, you'd set it up on another input, and that was generally where you put Netflix. And once Netflix really took off, you sort of started and stopped your TV experience on the input that had Netflix. And so that materially changed whether you'd be sampling linear television or not. What's necessary, and I think this is an opportunity for all of you guys, is a reimagining of what this is going to be and finding values in different formats and different approaches. And that goes for highlight lengths, that goes for types of games. I imagine, for instance, like I could see a scenario where especially as betting takes hold, where the NBA makes the winning and losing of an individual quarter more important. So like you might have 5 results, you have the 4 quarter results and then a final score, because that would enable people to watch for less time, actually see something that mattered that they could bet on. A bunch of stuff is going to be different, and it's going to be different sort of out of necessity. The last thing I'd say is, if you take a look at what Netflix is doing, if you take a look at what Spotify is doing, Amazon to a certain extent, you look at recommendation engines, the way they use algorithms, that kind of approach, I believe, is going to come everywhere. It's certainly going to be a bigger part of sports, which hasn't been. That, to me, is going to be an improvement.
Great. Corey?
Billy?
Yeah, kind of going back to something touched on earlier, is my question is, how do you see the changes to the name, image, and likeness rules in college sports affecting the broadcasting rights and landscape of that environment?
Casey Wasserman, who's head of Wasserman and head of the U.S. Olympic Committee, was on a call a couple weeks ago, and he just gave a great explanation for this thing. He said it's a bad idea that not only doesn't solve the problem, is likely to make things worse. And his point of view was that the only people who are going to benefit from it would be a handful of male athletes, mostly well-known football and basketball players, and it was really going to skew the value. It wasn't going to, no female players would get any value out of this. So whereas this was imagined as something that was going to like really sort of help the players or sort of level the playing field, he thought it was going to be uniquely unsuccessful. I just feel like there are going to be inevitable changes to college sports that I think are overdue. Personally, I think the one and done rule for basketball is silly. The players, the players, they're in classes for maybe a quarter. They don't go to classes, many of them, during basketball season. Then they leave to go join the pros. They're not really college students. They should just be in an NBA minor league, which is what they want to do. If college sports really was just college sports, if it wasn't a minor league for the pros, I believe it could be still fantastically popular. You'd have to get used to maybe differences in quality of play, but lots of things are changing, and it's quite possible that we could see the creation of a super league for college football on Saturdays. There'd be like 35 schools, Clemson, USC. I don't know, maybe Stanford, UCLA would be in there, maybe not, that are going to have this arms race with $1 million defensive coordinators and all this other stuff. And everybody else would play regular college football on a different level. I believe that all the NBA prospects are going to wind up going to the G League in time, and college basketball is going to be different. But to me, none of that is bad, especially if you had people who were in school because they wanted to be in school, and you could work out that value. So I think name and likeness hints at issues that have to be fixed, although I don't believe that one is actually going to solve the problems. I think Casey's right on it.
Okay, John, we only have one last question, so I don't want to leave one person. This is fascinating. So, Corey, ask the last question.
Holden?
We've seen recently Bryce Harper form a gaming partnership, and also like Spencer Dinwiddie try to turn his contract into cryptocurrency or perhaps source his free agent decision. I'm wondering, what other ways do you see athletes trying to monetize themselves?
I'm fascinated by blockchain technology and this concept of sort of creating digital scarcity, whether it's tickets or merchandise or being able to sort of own a little piece of Spencer Dinwiddie's contract. The U.S. regulatory situation right now is so negative for any even consideration of a cryptocurrency that probably going to be years before that happens. But I do think, and this gets to Fans Matter, I do think you're going to see teams move to models where fans can get some little form of equity in players or teams or arenas or whatever, and that's going to be part of what's necessary to move forward. That may be part, frankly, of what's necessary to help us support restaurants or other places we like, is more a sort of membership in something. So I think Spencer's idea is creative. Today, unfortunately, all you can do is maybe go to a movie with him. You can't even go to a movie now, but like, it's early. Bunch of these ideas I think are super creative. With no sports, there are more people day trading now. I have friends who run a really creative site called Stock Twits, which has seen its traffic just explode as you have more people doing day trading who normally would be following sports. So I think there's a nexus between financial technologies and sports, and you will see that manifest itself in membership schemes around merchandise, tickets, players, etc. I think it's going to happen. It just may take a while. I wish the U.S. regulatory was moving faster and more receptive to it. I guess we have bigger problems at the moment. I really appreciate getting to spend some time with you guys, and I hope you all have a great summer, and I hope we get back to normalcy for UCLA and for the rest of us.
JK, thank you so much. Very thoughtful.
Thanks, Eric.
A lot of things. Take care. So I thought that John did a great job of laying out a lot of these provocative things that are affecting the sports world, and a lot of thought starters.